History is often measured in noise, the roar of cannons, the screaming of dive bombers, the thunderous applause of 1 million people in a stadium. But in the early weeks of 1943, the most important historical event in the world was defined by something else entirely: a void. In small towns across the German countryside, from the snowy forests of Bavaria to the industrial heart of the Ruhr Valley, a terrifying pattern began to emerge. For 3 years, the German Postal Service had been the most reliable link in the Nazi Empire. Millions of letters traveled back and forth across a continent, connecting the front to the home. These letters were the lifeblood of German morale. They were the proof that Hans, or Peter, or Friedrich was still breathing, still fighting, and still coming home. But suddenly, in the winter of 1942, the letters from the Sixth Army, the pride of the German military, began to vanish. At first, the families were told it was just logistical delays due to the winter weather. Then, they were told the mail planes were being prioritized for ammunition. But as the weeks turned into months, the silence became deafening. Thousands of women stood at their windows, watching the postman walk down their street. They watched him stop at the neighbor's house, deliver a bill or a postcard from a different front, and then walk past their gate without a glance. This was the beginning of the Great Concealment. In the gilded halls of the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, Adolf Hitler and Joseph Goebbels were sitting on a truth so catastrophic that they were willing to erase an entire army from the news cycle rather than admit it. They were hiding a massacre. They were hiding a surrender. They were hiding the fact that the indestructible German army had been broken in the ruins of a city named after Joseph Stalin. But how do you keep a secret this big? How do you hide the deaths of 300,000 men from their own mothers? To answer that, we have to go back to the moment the myth was born. To understand why Hitler hid the defeat at Stalingrad, you have to understand that the Nazi regime wasn't just a government. It was a religion based on the idea of an unstoppable force. By the summer of 1942, the German Wehrmacht had achieved what most historians thought was impossible. They had conquered Poland in weeks. They had shattered the French army, supposedly the best in the world, in a matter of days. They had chased the British off the continent at Dunkirk. To the average German citizen, Hitler wasn't just a politician. He was a prophet who had restored German pride through a series of military miracles. There was a myth, as pervasive as the air they breathed, that the German army was indestructible. This wasn't just propaganda. It was a psychological reality. The German soldier was seen as a super soldier, a master of blitzkrieg who could overcome any obstacle through sheer will and technical superiority. When the invasion of the Soviet Union began in June 1941, this myth reached its peak. The initial victories were so massive, so overwhelming, that the German High Command famously believed the war was over within the first 6 weeks. They saw the Soviet Union as a rotten door that would fall apart with a single kick. But as the army pushed deeper into the vast, endless Russian steppe, something began to change. The roars of victory began to fade into the groans of a long, exhausting struggle. And Hitler, obsessed with symbols, fixed his eyes on a single point on the map, a city that stretched like a long ribbon along the banks of the Volga River. Stalingrad. It was a significant industrial city, yes. It was a transport hub for oil and grain. But for Hitler, its primary value was its name. It was the city of Stalin. To capture, it was to humiliate the Soviet leader. It was to prove, once and for all, that the German myth was superior to the Soviet reality. Hitler didn't just want to win a battle. He wanted to perform an exorcism on the Soviet spirit. He told his people the city was as good as taken. He told them the Soviet army was on its last legs. He promised them a final, glorious victory before the winter set in. It was a promise built on pride, and it would end in a slaughter that Hitler would spend the rest of the war trying to hide. In August 1942, The German Sixth Army arrived at the gates of Stalingrad. From a distance, it looked like another easy victory. The Luftwaffe had already turned most of the city into a burning skeleton of brick and wood. The Soviet defenders were pinned against the river with nowhere to run. But when the German infantry entered the streets, the indestructible army was met with a type of warfare they had never practiced. The Soviets didn't retreat. They hugged the German lines, staying so close that the German artillery and air force couldn't fire for fear of hitting their own men. The battle turned into a nightmare the Germans called Rattenkrieg, the War of the Rats. Imagine a landscape where every basement is a fortress, every sewer pipe is a sniper's nest, and every pile of rubble is a graveyard. The front line didn't move by miles anymore. It moved by inches. Soldiers fought for weeks over a single floor of an apartment building. They fought over a single machine shop in the Red October factory. This was the reality Hitler hid from the German public. While the radio in Berlin was playing triumphant music and announcing that German troops have reached the city center, those same troops were dying in the thousands for the sake of a single hallway. Hitler became obsessed. He refused to look at the mounting casualties. He refused to listen to his generals who told him that the Sixth Army was being hollowed out. He ordered more men, more tanks, and more fuel into the city, convinced that the sheer German would break the Soviet resistance. But while Hitler was staring at the rubble of a few streets, the Soviets were looking at the entire map. They were preparing a trap that would change history, and Hitler was about to walk right into it. By November 1942, the Sixth Army was exhausted. They held 90% of the city, but they were a broken force. They were huddled in the ruins, low on ammunition, and terrified of the approaching winter. Worse, Hitler had left the wings of his army exposed. To the north and south of Stalingrad, the lines were held by Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian troops. These men were under-equipped and lacked the anti-tank weapons needed to stop a major assault. Hitler's generals warned him. They told him the flanks were soft, but Hitler dismissed them. He believed the Soviets were too weak to launch a major offensive. He was wrong. On November 19, 1942, under the cover of a massive fog and a blizzard, the Red Army launched Operation Uranus. It was a pincer movement of terrifying proportions. Thousands of Soviet tanks smashed through the Romanian lines in the north and the south. The under-equipped Allies stood no chance. In just 4 days, the two Soviet spearheads met at the town of Kalik. The circle was complete. Suddenly, 300,000 German and Axis soldiers were besieged. They were in the Kessel, the cauldron. They were surrounded by a ring of Soviet steel that was growing thicker every hour. This is the exact moment when the military failure turned into a massive, organized lie. General Friedrich Paulus, the commander of the Sixth Army, knew the danger. He asked for the one thing that could save his men: permission to break out, to turn the army around and smash their way back to the German lines. Hitler's answer was a cold, absolute no. He ordered the Sixth Army to stand fast. He told them that Stalingrad was a fortress that would never be surrendered. In his mind, to retreat was to admit defeat, and to admit defeat was to destroy the myth of invincibility. Hitler chose to sacrifice 300,000 men rather than sacrifice his own ego. But he couldn't tell the German public that. He couldn't tell the families in Berlin that their sons were trapped in a circle of fire with no way out. So, he began to craft a new narrative. He told the people that the Sixth Army was bravely holding a forward position and that a massive relief effort was on its way. There was no relief effort. There was only the silence of the snow. To keep the Sixth Army in place, Hitler made a promise he knew he couldn't keep. He told them they would be supplied by air. Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, boastfully claimed that his planes could fly in 500 tons of supplies every single day. It was a mathematical fantasy. To deliver that much food, fuel, and ammunition, a plane would have to land in the cauldron every few minutes, 24 hours a day, in the middle of a Russian winter. The reality was a horror show. The Luftwaffe was already depleted. Their airfields were being captured. Their planes weren't winterized, and their engines froze solid in the 40-degree below zero temperatures. Instead of 500 tons, they were lucky to deliver 80. Some days, they delivered nothing at all. And what did they deliver? Because of the chaos and the lies, the cargo was often useless. Imagine a starving soldier, his feet black with frostbite, opening a supply crate only to find thousands of pounds of black pepper, or bags of marjoram, or luxury condoms and summer uniforms. While the soldiers were eating their horses and scraping the frozen earth for roots, Hitler was sitting in his headquarters, Wolf's Lair, eating hot meals and telling his propaganda team to keep the news heroic. He hid the starvation. He hid the fact that the indestructible German soldiers were now skeletal ghosts, dying not of bullets, but of hunger and lice-borne typhus. Letters from the front were intercepted and burned by the thousands. The Nazi leadership realized that if the people of Germany read the words of their dying sons, words of despair, words of betrayal, the home front would collapse. So, they enforced the Great Silence. They let the families believe their sons were still gallant heroes, while those sons were actually being erased from existence.